They left a line of flour across my driveway like a joke, but not the kind you laugh at. That was the morning I realized Willow Ridge wasn't a neighborhood anymore. It was a courtroom run by a woman named Marjorie Hale, who treated rules like scripture and people like case files. I stood on my porch with a coffee gone cold and thought, maybe this is the hill I should walk away from. And then I looked up and saw her truck idling across the street. I'm Ethan Cole. I moved out here for quiet, for a small yard, and the idea that folks mind their own business. I planted a vegetable bed, put up a rusty wind chime because my daughter liked the sound small, ordinary things. Marjorie and her board saw choices. They saw violations. A flagpole, a mailbox, a hedge trimmed 2 inches too low. Suddenly, everything was a paperwork fight. It first felt petty. Sunflowers cut down. The chime snapped in half. Soil overturned. A note pinned to a rock read, "For your own good, stop defying community standards." Neutral sounding, menacing. I called the board. They promised an investigation. My neighbor's doorbell camera showed someone on my property after dusk, a figure moving deliberately, not a random prank. That was the moment it stopped being about a plant. The HOA meeting should have been boring. I told her, standards are only worth caring about if they're for people, too. Someone in the back laughed, then coughed, and for a second it felt like a courtroom and a community center in the same breath. The retired cop tapped his pen like a metronome, and Marjorie's smile never reached the room. I started keeping records. Emails, photos, receipts for fines that appeared like micro sandbags around people's lives. Neighbors began to open up a driveway repave because a permit was refused until the owner paid. A mailbox removed with no hearing. Fines doubled overnight for small infractions. The pattern was methodical. Marjorie didn't answer with policy. She answered with escalation. Neighbors began to bring stories. Quiet ones at first, a single mother who'd been fined after a contractor's truck left gravel on the curb. A former schoolteacher who'd been told to remove a set of wind chimes that had hung for 20 years. An elderly man passed around a list of fees he said had appeared on his mailbox. Microfines that stacked until he couldn't afford the legal letters he needed. These weren't wild accusations. They were bits of paper, timestamps, and names, proof that turned whispers into evidence. One Friday night my mailbox was smashed and a note left. Pay attention. Another morning, stones were dropped on my porch with an invoice tied to a P.O. box linked to counsel for the HOA. This wasn't a petty spat, it had planning. We could step back and let the quiet return, or we could press. We pressed. The clubhouse meeting was fluorescent and tense. Neighbors squeezed in the chairs. Marjorie's supporters sat stiff. The retired cop nodded at every procedural point. I sat across from her, palms damp, my daughter's drawings folded in my pocket like proof of what we were standing for. A hush settled, the kind that makes people choose a side by the tilt of their chin. Marjorie called us partisan. She said we were making a spectacle. Her allies argued order, property values, the sanctity of standards. Then the room began to hear testimony, Gerald's doorbell footage, receipts showing unjust fines, stories about families who moved away rather than live under a slow squeeze. People who had kept quiet for years began to speak, and their voices added up. That night didn't settle things, it made stakes visible. When the man pulled the pistol, he didn't shout for blood, he shouted for retreat. Back off, or you'll regret it. Hearing that, I saw the courage in faces fold like paper. A woman who'd been ready to argue minutes before clutched her child and stepped behind a parked SUV. The man stashed the gun and walked away with a look that said he'd shown his card. Other neighbors looked at us like we were a place that could tip into more than paperwork. That night, I couldn't sleep thinking about how quickly a rule book turns into a rule with teeth. After that, the community split. Some doubled down behind Marjorie, convinced she protected values. Others, shaken, realized rules enforced by threat are not rules at all. We organized a vote to remove her from the presidency. The board delayed, sent clarifications, tried procedural hurdles, but once neighbors saw the footage, read the receipts, the tally shifted. On the day of the vote, the clubhouse smelled faintly of coffee and lemon cleaner, an ordinary smell for an extraordinary moment. People filed in with grocery bags and dogs, with proof and petitions, and testimonies were short and sharp, or long and soft. A woman who'd lost sleep for months as fines mounted. A young dad threatened with a landscaping fine for hanging a bird feeder. At one point, Marjorie rose and said, "This is about order, not personal grievances, and her voice had the same smoothness that had carried her complaints for years. Testimonies stacked like a slow drumbeat until the room could no longer pretend it was undecided. Gerald played doorbell footage, a shadow moving through my yard, and a neighbor read a ledger of fines with dates and amounts. People who'd been polite and silent for years started to speak with a calm that cut through the pomp. Marjorie's allies called us agitators. One woman shouted that we were destroying our town. I stood there thinking about how fragile civility is when it's weaponized by someone who confuses control with care. When the motion passed, there was no triumphant music, just a long, collective exhale and Marjorie packing a box with the same thin courtesy she'd used in every complaint. She left angry emails and a county petition to tighten rules elsewhere, and she tried to rally her supporters beyond our lane lines. People texted me, some with congratulations, some with warnings. The neighborhood didn't become a utopia overnight. The grass didn't suddenly grow. Afterwards, life didn't snap back into the picture-perfect card the HOA brochures show. There were repair bills and awkward waves on sidewalks, and Marjorie sent angry emails that turned into a county petition to tighten rules elsewhere. Yet people began to ask questions at block parties. Someone brought a pie to share, and a conversation started about what we wanted Willow Ridge to be, not what an enforcement manual said it should be. My daughter and I planted sunflowers, and she pressed dirt into her palms and asked, "Will the mean lady come back?" I told her people change, and people don't, and sometimes both are true here, and that part of living somewhere is choosing to stand for how you want it to feel. Planting was more than a garden act. It was a claim that small joys matter. I won't pretend I was noble every minute. I lost sleep, made enemies, and pushed neighbors out of comfort. But I didn't want my daughter's memory of our block to be the ledger of what we couldn't do. I wanted it to be the ledger of what we chose to keep. If you live somewhere decisions are made behind closed doors, if someone's version of order is shrinking lives, here's what I learned. Document, talk, gather neighbors, and use the rules not as weapons, but as tools. Ask for written policies, collect receipts, and bring your story to the room where decisions are made. Vote, testify, be ready to be ordinary and, occasionally, inconvenient. So tell me, have you ever had someone decide what your yard should look like? Have you watched a rule become a power move?